Your Excellencies, His Excellency John Dramani Mahama, the President of the Republic of Ghana, Ambassador Maged Abdelaziz, Under-Secretary General, Special Advisor on Africa, United Nations, Amir Dossal, Chairman of the Global Partnerships Forum, all honorable ministers present, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It is my distinct pleasure to offer you this warm welcome on behalf of Africa Investor to our 2014 African Head of State Investment Advisory Council Dialogue. As many of you know, the Council was launched here at the New York Stock Exchange some years ago in partnership with the African Union, UN-OSA, and the Global Partnerships Forum as a platform to engage heads of state on the African investment agenda during the UN General Assembly. Your Excellency, today we have engaged the institutional investment community with presentations from leaders from African-listed companies, stock exchanges, and our pension and sovereign wealth funds who have ably set the scene. This session, Your Excellency, is really designed to highlight to our international investment partners that our African political leadership at the highest levels seeks and welcomes their partnership and their investment. A key issue that the Council has taken up is to boost intra-African investment, which remains extremely low at a mere 5% compared to other parts of the world which are currently in excess of 60%. However, we believe that by working in partnership with the African investment community, along with heads of state as champions, we can significantly advance the mobilization of African domestic pension and sovereign wealth fund capital to achieve a compound growth per annum of intra-African investment in the region of 25 to 30% over the next 10 years. We have prioritized the development of more co-investment partnerships as the most effective method to increasing intra-African investment flows by employing domestic African capital from African pension and sovereign wealth funds, and we think that's the best way to advance this. Our focus, therefore, is primarily on infrastructure investment projects that will create jobs and stimulate capital market growth and transactions. Africa is set to have the highest growth of sovereign wealth funds and the largest number of sovereign wealth funds in the world over the next 36 months. We also know that Africa's 6 largest pension funds in terms of assets are projected to exceed $7 trillion by 2050, which, coupled with the several trillion available in the US institutional investment market over that same period of time, could be a difference maker for growth and job creation in Africa, as well as the United States of America. We are therefore delighted to announce here today that we are launching a report to provide some advocacy and insight on this subject. You should have a copy of this report in your folders. The report was launched in partnership with the ACP Business Climate. The report is entitled The African Sovereign Wealth and Pension Fund Summit Report on how to mobilize domestic African capital as a tool to leverage global institutional capital. The report was inspired by the outcomes of the Heads of State Dialogue held here last year and the EU-Africa Summit recommendations, which gave rise to a number of follow-up actions. We held a consultation in May in Abuja, Nigeria, on the same subject, entitled the Africa Investor African Pension and Sovereign Wealth Fund Forum. The report highlights priority recommendations on how pension and sovereign wealth funds can better participate as lead infrastructure investors on African projects, particularly through modernizing regulatory environments and instituting solid Pan-African co-investment programs. We at African Investor continue to encourage our domestic and institutional investment partners to participate in investments across the continent, a number of projects by developing new tools and new platforms to de-risk their participation. For our part, this year, Africa Investor launched the continent's first Pan-African Investable Infrastructure Investment Index of listed African companies operating in the infrastructure and contributing towards that growth. In addition to this, Africa Investor is happy to announce the AI Sovereign Infrastructure Investment Platform for African pension and sovereign wealth funds. The platform will have a unique co-investment program designed to extend and increase the level of co-investment between both African pension and sovereign wealth funds and also amongst their international peers. Your Excellency, in closing, please we applaud the fact that you could get through the New York traffic today and be here with us. And we look forward to your leadership and hearing your insights and your commitments towards engaging the institutional investment community. We stand ready as your investment partner to increase intra-African investment and global institutional investment into the continent. So on that note, I'd like to now call on our friend and partner, Ambassador Abdelaziz, Under-Secretary General, Office of the Special Advisor on Africa, to give some opening remarks. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Hubert. Your Excellency, President Mahama, honorable ministers, distinguished guests, it gives me great pleasure to warmly welcome you to this 2014 African Heads of State and Government Investment Working Lunch. At the outset, allow me to convey the warm greetings from the United Nations Secretary General, His Excellency Ban Ki-moon, and to reiterate his commitment and the commitment of the United Nations to partnership, in particular partnership with the private sector for Africa's peace and sustainable development. It is within this spirit that the Office of the Special Advisor on Africa, in collaboration with the African Union and the African Regional Economic Communities, is pleased to co-sponsor this high-level event with Africa Investor, the Global Partnership Forum, and the New York Stock Exchange Euronext. Let me particularly welcome His Excellency Mr. John Dramani Mahama, the President of the Republic of Ghana. Excellency, we are honored to have you here with us. Your presence sends a strong message to the global investment community that Africa is ready to do business and to engage the world community in order to promote and attract investment. Allow me also to welcome the African high-level participants at the ministerial level from Kenya, Nigeria, Mozambique, Rwanda, Morocco, Malawi, and to also welcome the Deputy Chairperson of the African Union, who is going to join us in a short period of time. Distinguished guests, over the past years, this event has contributed to raising awareness of business opportunities in Africa and advocating for repositioning the continent as a competitive, attractive, and preferred international investment destination. Nowadays, investment, public and private, domestic and foreign, has become a center of interest of the global development policy. Investment is as a driving force and the prerequisite for economic growth and sustainable development, since it develops the productive capacity, creates wealth, and generates job opportunities, which in turn contribute to poverty eradication. As United Nations member states are currently shaping the post-2015 development agenda, they have stressed the importance of investment for financing the global development programs that will deliver a life of dignity for all. In Africa, the United Nations has been pursuing its commitment to mobilize significant investment for Africa's inclusive growth, sustainable development, and peace and security, depending more and more on the private sector engagement and commitment. At the same time, African leaders were working hard to evaluating the African experience over the last 50 years and preparing a creative, innovative, and ambitious transformative agenda for the next 50 years, based on regional integration and popular participation. It is in this spirit that the United Nations intensified its activities in support of Africa, as evidenced recently by the high-level thematic debate on the promotion of investment in Africa organized by the President of the 68th session of the General Assembly. My office also will be organizing an Africa Week in the middle of October, and in this Africa Week, we will intend to support the African Transformative Agenda 2063. And Agenda 2063, as you know, is anchored on structural transformation, industrialization and value addition to commodities, the modernization of agriculture and the development of agribusiness, the preservation of the environment and addressing climate change, the development of world-class infrastructure, the establishment of a continental free trade area by 2017, and silencing the guns in Africa by 2020, just to mention a few. The implementation of Agenda 2063 no doubt envisages a strategic role for the private sector in generating dynamism in economic activities, creating wealth, generating employment, and in mobilizing resources. And I am confident that you, as the representatives of the private sector, will carry this responsibility through. Excellencies, distinguished guests, today Africa is on the move and poised for real growth. The narrative is one of hope and optimism for its people and for the world. Not only African economies are growing fast with the prospects to be close to 5% in 2014, but also African countries have been implementing strategies to promote sound macroeconomic policies, structural reforms, and consolidate good governance, rule of law, peace and stability, and more predictable business environment for investors, as the cornerstone of an ambitious transformative agenda that is people-centered and correspond to the aspirations of Africa. In view of the significant contribution of the African private sector to the economy, including the generation of 70% of jobs, 2/3 of investments, and 70% of the GDP, several African countries have strengthened their engagement with the private sector by enacting public-private partnerships as well. African economies have also started to tap into financial instruments like sovereign wealth funds, as just mentioned by Hubert, pension funds, private equity funds, and sovereign bonds. But all those significant achievements could simply vanish if we do not pay the desired attention also to peace and security on the one hand, and to pandemic diseases on the other. The spread of Ebola in West Africa does not only constitute a health problem to the West African region and to the world, it has already started to deliver a severe blow to many of the achievements that countries like Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone made through their national and regional efforts and through the support of the United Nations. The emergency actions taken by the Economic Community of West African States, the African Union, supported by the emergency action taken by the United Nations Secretary General, and the decisions by the UN General Assembly and the UN Security Council to establish the United Nations Mission for Ebola Emergency Response, UNMIR, along with the generous decision by His Excellency the President of Ghana to host this mission and to continue to provide a vital air bridge to the affected countries through Accra, will open the door for effective international response in this regard. While appreciating the African Union's admirable solidarity and impressive contributions of military assets, human resources, financing, and supplies for many governments and organizations, including the United States, China, Cuba, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Ghana, Kenya, Rwanda, Uganda, and many others, there is still urgent need for significant resources for governments, private sector, and civil society. Last week, the United Nations outlined a set of critical needs totaling almost $1 billion over the next 6 months. To help the 3 affected countries to effectively deal with this pandemic, the UN believes that air and sea shipping companies should not isolate those countries in a manner that would exacerbate the economic and financial situation that is deteriorating already as a result of this pandemic. Beyond, it is crucial to incorporate health issues among our investment priorities in the African continent. Finally, I trust that the message of the African Union and the United Nations will be heeded, and that we will together overcome this emergency situation and dedicate all our efforts to investing in a healthy, prosperous, and forward-looking Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Maged Abdulaziz, and once again, special thanks to Hubert for bringing us all together. We go back many years when he had approached the UN to bring Africa investments and the idea at the international level. And today we are so excited to actually have our partner, the African Union Commission. The Deputy Chairperson is here, and I would like to invite you to come and please join us at the podium. So you have been part of this process for us right from the very beginning. So as Ambassador Maged Abdulaziz and Hubert Danso mentioned, we are honored to have President Mahama in our midst. President Mahama does not need any introduction. And you should know one thing, he's a historian, he's a communicator, and he's a writer. He was Minister of Communications. He's one of the most followed people on Twitter and Facebook, in case you didn't know. So he's savvy in this field, actually. Yesterday we had the meeting of the Broadband Commission at the United Nations, where we want to accelerate broadband access. The President has already achieved that and beyond. So we want to warmly welcome you here, sir, and to hear your perspectives. In our midst are people who are eagerly waiting to hear from your thoughts, your ideas, and also ideas of how to connect Africa to the outside world. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much. Let me begin by expressing my regrets for arriving here late. New York traffic, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, ensured that we did the last 3 minutes on foot. We had to walk the rest of the way to be able to get here at all. Time is spent, so I'm not going to take too much time. I'm sure, knowing the kind of people in this room, you've all done your research about Ghana, and so I'm not going to bore you telling you that Ghana is on the west coast of Africa. And the last time I checked, they were still there. In the last decade, there's been a lot of excitement about Africa, and there's been hope about Africa, and you have phrases like Africa Rising and all that. I just want to temper that and say it's not without its challenges and its problems. And often one is tempted to think about, an investment destination where all problems have been resolved and, it's they lived happily ever after story. It's not exactly that. Yes, there are very good prospects for investment in Africa. And us leaders in all our countries are doing our best to create the kind of environment that makes it, enabling for investors to want to put their money in there and be able to make a good rate of return. Ghana started early after independence. It was the first country to break away from colonial domination. And we started with a state enterprise model. And so the state was involved in almost every facet of our lives, in production of shoes, in production of matches, for lighting fires, in production of plastics, building materials for houses, in the transport sector, in aviation. Just name it. Every facet of our lives was based on the state enterprises model. And our first president was a socialist, President Kwame Nkrumah, and he built the economy on that model. In later years, we realized that we had all these state enterprises, that were inefficient, and government had to, pay subsidies to them every year in order to keep them afloat. And so from the mid-'80s, when we adopted our first structural adjustment program with the IMF, we began to change the model and decided to go for a private sector model. And we started to offload a lot of those state enterprises to the private sector. We have emphasized on creating an enabling environment for the private sector to grow and advance. And we use the hackneyed phrase of the private sector being the engine of growth. And so we have been creating an environment to increase foreign direct investment, but also to boost domestic investment. The private sector has been growing, but not at as fast a rate as we would have wanted. Recently, Ghana has been one of the top performers in Africa and has been seen as one of the countries that has the potential to be the next batch of emerging nations from Africa. That has not been without its challenges. Over the last 5 years, our economy has grown significantly. In 2011, with the advent of oil and gas, it was touted to be the fastest growing economy at almost 14% of GDP that year. Over the last several years, our average growth rate has been above 6%, and last year was 7.4%. But we've had macroeconomic challenges as a result of several factors. I'm not ready to recount here, but from 2012, we began to see a deficit on the fiscal of close to 12%, 11.8% of GDP. And we gradually saw an increase in inflation. And as at last August, inflation had crept up from single digit to 15.9%. We also saw a slide in the value of the currency of almost 30%, which was significant. And so we have been taking corrective measures to restore macroeconomic stability. We came out with a homegrown fiscal consolidation policy, which we started to implement to increase revenues and bring expenditures back under control. One of the major problems we have had has been with the wage bill. We were implementing a new salary scheme to create equity in the public sector wage bill, and it ran away and created a wage spiral, which increased wages from somewhere slightly above 3 billion to almost 9 billion Ghana cedis, which was a very significant increase in expenditure. But we've been putting in place steps to try and tame, that over expenditure. Recently, we realized that we needed, some more assistance to be able to get the situation under control, and so we made a request to the IMF to come and work with us to implement a program. And so as I was leaving Ghana, we had an IMF team that was working with us to come up with a new program. We anticipate that the preliminary talks should be over by this week, 25th, and then we'll continue during the annual meetings of the World Bank and the IMF. And it's my hope that by January, we should start a 3-year IMF program to try and stabilize the macroeconomic environment, but also not only stabilize the macro environment, also undertake a strong program of institutional reforms in order that we create a sustainable base for the macro to be sustainable over time. We are also looking at a strong program which would bring in the World Bank and the IMF and all the other developmental institutions to institute a program that continues to guarantee investments in economic infrastructure in order that the economy can continue to grow, and also to grow the private sector in order that we're able to create more jobs. As part of the program, too, I want to see a strong social intervention program that helps to cushion the poor and vulnerable in society. And so these are the vision, and this is the vision in which we're going into discussions with the IMF. We recently went on the market for our 3rd Eurobond, and I must say, with some amount of success. I had feared the worst. There were anticipation of coupon rates of above 9%. We came in massively at 8.125%, which was quite a relief for us. A lot of that money is going to go into our capital expenditure, investment in infrastructure, but a significant portion of it, 250 million of it, is going to go into what we call the Ghana Infrastructure Investment Fund, which is going to be a new investment vehicle for financing infrastructure in Ghana. Ghana has a huge need for investment, in respect of our fledgling oil and gas sector, which has very good prospects going forward. We have several American companies out of Texas working in Ghana, Cosmos, Vanco, and Hess, and so many of them are active in Ghana's hydrocarbon sector. The potential is good. We have one operational field, which is the Jubilee field, and there's a second field that is expected to come on stream in 2016, which is the 10th field that would increase the amount of oil that Ghana is able to produce. In addition, we have a third prospect, which is the ENI Sankofa field, which we expect to come on stream end 2016 into 2017. And so the potential of a growing oil and gas industry in Ghana is very good. We are about to commission a gas processing plant to bring in enough gas to initially power about 500 megawatts of thermal energy. That will be expanded as the new prospects in oil and gas come on stream, like the 10 field and the Sankofa field, which has a lot of gas. And so as a result of that, we are in partnership with the United States of America. I came away from the last US-Africa summit with the most tangible results back to my people with a check of almost $500 million under the Millennium Challenge Compact, which is supposed to be invested into the energy sector. We're looking to position Ghana as the energy hub of West Africa to produce enough power, both to meet the increasing demand for power of our own country, but become a net exporter of power to countries that have a deficit. Most of them who are neighbors have a deficit in power. And so we're looking to increase our own power production so that we can export the excess to other countries that have a huge demand for power. The MCC investment is supposed to go into generation, transmission, and distribution to improve efficiency of the whole value chain for power production. One of the things we're envisaging under the Millennium Challenge Compact is a strong private sector participation in power production in Ghana. And so we have an MOU with General Electric, which we call the Ghana 1000 project, to produce 1,000 megawatts of power and inject it into the Ghanaian transmission grid. There are other independent power producers who have signed power purchase agreements to set up gas-fired thermal plants, to be able to produce power both to satisfy Ghana's power demand and also for export through what we call the West African Power Pool. Ghana is a member of the Power Pool, through which all the transmission grids of the West African countries are interconnected. And so if you have excess power in one country, you can transfer it to another country. We have opportunities for investment in transport. For those of you who know West Africa, there are several significant ports along the West African coast, washed by the Atlantic Ocean. And the significant ones are the Abidjan port, Dakar port, Tema port, Lomé port, and the Lagos port in Apapa. All these ports are in competition with each other to generate as much traffic as we can. And so we are about to embark on a major expansion of our main port, which is the Tema port, to be able to improve the volumes that come in and to improve the turnaround time of ships so that we can bring our imports in faster with less hassle, and then also to be able to capture more of the traffic of the landlocked countries like Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. We're also looking to position Ghana as the aviation hub for West Africa with a strong sub-regional feed into Accra as the transit stop to put passengers on long-haul aircrafts to Europe, to America, to Asia, to Latin America, and the Middle East. And so that's another of the visions we have. Other sectors in which there's been strong investment is telecoms. Ghana has one of the widest, extensions of broadband mobile in the sub-region. And anywhere I go in the country, even the remotest places, I'm able to access my internet and do my WhatsApp messaging and all that, and so it's a good environment. Agriculture is also a priority, and we are looking to increase production of many staples that our people eat and other agricultural products in respect of their value chain. And so we're seeing strong investment in rice production, in soya, in maize production, in poultry, in aquaculture, in tomato production, in vegetable cooking oil, and all that. And so investors who are interested in that sector, can take a look. Let me just end up with what most investors are concerned about, and that is risks. You want to minimize your risk as much as possible. Of course, Ghana is in West Africa, and so all the risk in respect of security, in respect of health, affect our country too. In West Africa, the three main flashpoints are northern Mali, because of the activities of the Tuareg rebels in that area. The other flashpoint is northeastern Nigeria in respect of Boko Haram and the security threat that it poses. And the next risk you might talk about is in 2015, 5 of our countries in West Africa are going to go to elections with different factors that could, pose as risks in any election year. But I believe that we have the mechanisms to be able to handle a lot of this, and we're doing that. We had to send a peace force into Mali to guarantee Mali's sovereignty. And since then, there have been talks going on, first in Burkina Faso and Ouagadougou, in which a roadmap was agreed. And just a few months ago, after the ECOWAS meeting, another meeting was convened in Algeria, and all the protagonists to the tensions in Mali signed on to the roadmap, to try and resolve that issue. And so that one is going quite properly. Not so the Boko Haram menace. Boko Haram is expanding its ability to inflict more violence in Nigeria, and we need to work around and see how we can find a solution to that threat. Happily, the international community has responded, US, France, and UK, and they are working together with the Nigerian government to see how they can mount a better response to the threat that Boko Haram poses in the sub-region. Like I said, 2015, we have Guinea, we have Nigeria, we have Cote d'Ivoire, we have Burkina Faso, we have Togo, all going for elections. And each of them carry their own risks. With Burkina Faso, there is the issue of the term limit. The incumbent president is wanting to amend the constitution to allow him to run, another term in office, and that is creating its own tensions. In Nigeria, of course, I spoke about Boko Haram and what is happening there. In Cote d'Ivoire is fairly more stable, and as long as the alliance between the PDC and President Ouattara's party holds, my expectation is that that government might win a second term, and I guess that would be a good thing for Cote d'Ivoire, having come out of a conflict that was created by a disputed election. I think that some stability in Cote d'Ivoire will be helpful to the whole sub-region. Guinea has elections too, and there have been quite some tensions there. My hope is that we'll be able to manage those tensions in order that they have a good election and they're able to continue on the road to peace. Togo is our neighbor, and we take an interest in what happens there. And I'm sure that with the mechanisms we have in ECOWAS, we'll be able to ensure that all these elections go peacefully and we don't have any untoward situation. I guess the most topical threat currently is Ebola. And I visited the 3 Ebola countries recently as a visit of solidarity to try to break the ostracization that they have been subjected to as a result of the disease. This is the first time there's been an outbreak of Ebola in West Africa, and it actually caught everybody by surprise. Our people don't understand the disease. They don't, really know how to react to it. And so the initial reaction has been one of panic, one of misunderstanding. But during my recent visit, I realized that people are coming to terms, so they're beginning to understand how the disease is spread. And with knowledge and awareness comes power. And so the people are getting empowered to be able to protect themselves. The thing about Ebola is it goes to the most, important human nature or instinct that we have, and that is to give care to our fellows, either your children or your wife or your brother or your sister. I mean, Ebola attacks caregivers. And so for people who care for the sick, either a relative or a health worker, it's them who are most at risk of catching Ebola and dying. And it creates quite heart-rending scenes. I mean, if you see a mother that is sick of Ebola, and a child's natural instinct is to go to his mother, but then it risks getting infected if the child goes to the mother. And so keeping the mother and child separate is, a tragedy, that it's very difficult to accept. And that's why we need to all respond and ensure that we get this back under control. The peculiar thing about Ebola in West Africa, it's happened in East and Central Africa, and it's always been very quickly contained. There have been several outbreaks in East and Central Africa that have been quickly contained. And so the whole world started watching, thinking that, oh, well, I'm sure this thing will be contained in a relatively short period. So the initial international response was very slow in coming. And I had thought that with an Ebola outbreak in West Africa, it was going to be worse than in East and Central Africa because that is a more mobile region. People move more freely across borders in West Africa than they do in some of the remote communities in the jungles of East and Central Africa. And we all have a 90-day visa-free visit to each other's countries. You don't need a visa to go to another West African country. You find a West African in Lagos today, tomorrow you find him in Dakar, the next day he's in Ouagadougou. And so when this outbreak occurred, I mean, it should have struck all of us that with the way people move in West Africa, it was likely that the disease was going to spiral, across borders. But the initial panic reaction of closing borders and stopping airline flights, have made the situation more difficult. When I went to the 3 countries, the situation was quite dire. The airports were eerily quiet, no planes on the tarmac. And the airline, airport workers were either resting under trees or lying on top of those their tug machines with nothing to do. And what it does is to prevent personnel and logistics from being able to come into those countries. And so as chairman of ECOWAS, I immediately offered to use Accra as a staging post to create an air corridor into the countries. And I had a discussion with the Secretary General, and he accepted. And on the basis of that, we have this new UN mission that's going to take place. And Ghana is willing to offer every assistance to the United Nations to be able to make this mission a success. My anticipation is that if all of us put our shoulders to it, I mean, within a 6 to 9 months period, we should be able to turn this outbreak around and send it back to where it came from. And so with those words, I guess I'll end here, and thank you very much for listening to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. That was absolutely inspiring, and it's amazing what things are going on, and often the challenge is communicating that information. So I know you've led the way as the previously Minister of Communication, and how you're actually, Mr. President, you are the first president born after the independence of Ghana, if I'm not mistaken. So it's historic first. You will have an opportunity to ask the President some questions. We've got a wonderful ministerial panel ahead of us as well. But we wanted to take the opportunity with the presence of the Vice Chairperson, the Deputy Chairperson of the African Union Commission, Mr. Erastus Mwansha. I hope I get the name right, sir. I apologize if I don't. He's joined us, and I'm so privileged that he's here. He's also the chair of ECOWAS, which is the group which is West African Community. ECOWAS works very closely with the UN, with your office, and also ECOWAS provides peacekeeping support to the United Nations. So it's a very important component for us. Mr. Mwansha, may I request you to please say a few remarks, and then we'll go into Q&A as well. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much, our Master of Ceremony, and thank you for your introductory remarks. You have asked me to speak or make a few remarks so that we can, I'm sure everybody is anxious to ask some questions, particularly to President Mahama, who really epitomizes Africa's best. And he has given us an example of West Africa, but which also, in a way, reflects the entire continent. If you have followed the story of Ghana, that is the story of Africa. And by the way, as he said, well, Ghana is still in West Africa. I should also say, Africa is not a country. Africa is a continent. Now, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, may I first of all acknowledge the presence of many ministers here and distinguished participants that have come to join us in this, and also to thank the co-organizers of this event for this very timely event. Timely because we are addressing one of Africa's key issues, and that is closing Africa's transformation financing gap. And before I address that particular aspect in a very succinct manner, let me just highlight some 4 points. The first point is Africa is growing. The question is, where is this growth coming from? Let me suggest there are 4 major growth areas for Africa. The first is that if you look at Africa's trajectory, in the last 10 years, 15 years, 4 significant developments have taken place. The first one is macroeconomic stability or prudence. A few ministers of finance will be here and they will be testifying to that. And this has provided Africa's growth. The second one, peace dividend. In the last 10 years, in spite of the fact that the world continues to highlight a few cases, a few setbacks, Africa is benefiting from peace dividends. More than 90% of Africans now live in what you would call peaceful area. The third point is the demand for Africa's resources in the last 10 years has been huge. And finally, Africa has also diversified its market and partnerships. Having said this, although Africa's growth has been good, averaging 5 to 10% in some countries, there are some worrying signals. The first signal is that we still have very high unemployment, we still have very high poverty, and particularly among the youth, the unemployment is worrying. And that is why our leaders, the African heads of state and government, in the last few years, have decided to tackle this head-on. And one of the instruments I've put in place at the continental level is to develop what we call Agenda 2063. Globally, this is what you might call the post-2015 development agenda. It is our hope that when this post-2015 development agenda is negotiated, it will mirror that which we have done in Africa. because this, again, will give us synergy globally and Africa-wise for us to be able to address the key issues that confront the continent. And what are these issues? And that's point number 2. The first is poverty that is high in the continent, and we feel there are instruments on the ground that can tackle this poverty. The second one, skills revolution, including science and technology and innovation. We need massive investment in this particular area. The third is transformation of the African economy, particularly focusing on beneficiation. If you look at Africa's exports, they are largely really raw materials. And if you look at some of the statistics that are worrying, look at cocoa, coffee, and the rest. Just to give you some figures, which were highlighted just recently when we had this summit here in Washington. The coffee industry value in the global market is about 100 billion. Africa gets less than 10 billion of that. And yet Africa produces that coffee. And that is part of what we would like to see in terms of beneficiation, that we would have Africa export cocoa or coffee or whatever it is in final products. The fourth area that is extremely important for investment is agriculture and agribusiness. It's no again saying that if you look at the future of the world economy, Africa has to be the basket. If Africa doesn't step up, then actually globally, this is not for the benefit of Africa, it's the benefit of humankind. Africa has to be the basket for food production come 2050. And the fifth area is interconnection of the continent. At the moment, the continent is virtually virgin. Connectivity, the old system that was there was not meant to really have Africa connect with Africa. And President Mahama has just given a few examples of some of the projects, pipeline, railway, whatever it is, ICT. These are key for the continent. The fifth one is, of course, trade within the continent, which is very low at the moment, averaging about 12%, but where Africa has the future if Africa is going to use its population dividend to be able to transform its economy. And the seventh one is youth as its driver's renaissance. Again, this is all in the public domain, and you know much about it, that Africa is the youngest continent in the world, and a continent for that matter for the future. But we also stand a risk if we don't take advantage of the youth by giving them skills, giving them employment. Associated with this is also the issue of gender, which is an area of concern for Africa, because if you look particularly at women folk, not many of them are in the mainstay of the economy. And yet if you look at some of the agriculture sectors like agriculture, they contribute the most. And finally, what President Mahama has talked about, mobility, which is in West Africa and which we would like to see throughout the continent. The final one, and which will bring me to the third point, is, well, no, before that, is also expanding the democratic and the people's democratic space and the people-centered, governance. And the 12th one, I'm just giving the key programs for the continent, is domestic resource mobilization. And that brings me to the third point, which is really to look at what is Africa's financing gap like? It goes into billions, and no one can give you a precise figure, but we can give you some indications by some of the sectors. Just to indicate, we have in Africa developed a number of flagship programs. One such program is in the area of infrastructure, which is called Program for Infrastructure Development, which runs into billions. At the moment, the docket of a number of projects we have run into over 350 billion. We have a program on agriculture, again, very well detailed, which goes into action at national level, regional level, at continental level. It also runs into billions. We have a program on Pan-African University, I talked about skills development. Whereas Africa, we want to really have skills revolution by training lots of, at the moment, if you look at the people we are sending to the market, annually, we are sending about 7 million youth in the market. But if you look at their skills, they are not quite employable. And so we need to interrogate that aspect so that we can improve on skills. And the fifth one is on the continental free trade area that I mentioned. In fact, we are keeping our eyes on 2017 as a date that we should start to see the implementation of the continental free trade area. And finally, the peace and security architecture. What President Mahama said here clearly illustrates that we have two sides to the coin. If you are going to have peace, development, you must have peace. And without peace, you can't have development. Without development, you can't have peace. The two are critical for the continent. And the good thing about the continent, again, epitomized by what my president has just said here, the African leaders have taken the ownership, the leadership, and action to try and make sure that the continent is at peace with itself and also contribute to global peace. Now, and that brings me to the last point, which is, of course, resource mobilization for the continent. As I indicated earlier, if you look at the needs, let's take one example. The World Bank has given us an estimate that in the area of climate change, in mitigation and adaptation alone, Africa will need close to 1 trillion. Africa will need close to 1 trillion. Well, that is not sunk investment. In fact, the studies show that with that kind of investment, and that is annually, in the coming years, Africa will be the driver of global economy. And so this is a huge, huge need, but also a huge investment opportunity. Now, where will these resources come from? One can go on and indicate in all these sectors that I've indicated. First, as my good brother Abdulaziz was saying, as I was walking in, Africa is now looking at how we can mobilize internal resources. One of the areas we're looking at, first of all, is the sovereign funds. The second one is we're looking at private equity funds and bonds, but we are also looking at how we can stop leakages that Africa is experiencing by way of improving on tax collection and also illicit transfer of funds from the continent. And finally, we're also looking at areas of taxation. But of course, all this will be Africa's effort. We hope that, and as the President has indicated, Africa is still open to investment. What we're seeing, particularly investment from the US and Europe, the pace is not as high as we would like to see. And we leave this to you to tell us what's happening. But we see, for instance, Asia, the pace is picking up. And so we would like, as we engage each other, to see how can we step this up, because the climate is conducive for sure. You can see we're addressing issues of peace. We are trying to address the issue of competitiveness, and also the returns in Africa are good. The question is, why are you not writing your checks? And I think after this, we should hope to see that we get our way forward to see more investment into Africa, because that's where the return is, and that's where the future is. I thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for putting out the 5-point plan for the African Union Commission. Indeed, as Ambassador Maged Abdulaziz mentioned, 2663 was adopted earlier this year. And these are all what I call roads to new investment opportunities, how Africa is opening up. In fact, when the deputy chairman came into office, his mission was, it's Africa time, if I'm not mistaken. So Africa time is indeed correct, taking place right now. And I'd like to take this opportunity to invite you to ask questions to our Honorable President Mahama and also to the Deputy Chairperson. Ma'am, may I request you to give your name, introduce yourself, and just be brief, please. Roving mic is just coming to you. If I can pass that, and then I'll come to you. It's just coming.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Oh, wow, so cold. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Adiola Otunoga, and I want to thank everybody for showing up also and give honor and protocol that is due. Thank you, sir. My question is, from my name, I'm Nigerian, and Nigeria and Ghana seems to be brothers and sisters in a kindly fashion over the years. And recently, the Yali youth just came back, and some of them are returning back now to Africa and their various countries. I know Nigeria is doing certain things. I didn't know what exactly the Ghanaian ones are doing. Are they being put back into the workforce? Is the government taking them on? Is the government giving them loans? As the man said before, I'm sorry, I don't know your name, Africa is the youngest population. What exactly are we doing? Did we have to really wait for US to tell us to bring 500 people to America, or are we individually taking up the responsibility to help this youth?
Thank you. I'll take 2 or 3 questions, then we'll come back. There's a lady behind you, and then I'll come to you, sir. Please.
Thank you very much. Dr. Shadi Farangrazi, Biotrans International, Denver, Colorado. I'm also faculty at University of Denver. I teach innovation and entrepreneurship. So this question, actually 2 questions addressed to President Mahama. I really enjoyed your talk, but a couple of different things. One is that you mentioned about investment in Ghana, and I know a number of other places in Africa related to fossil fuels. One thing that I think is of interest to a lot of us is that if there are initiatives focused on other types of investment, for example, in renewable fuels, as well as green technology, life sciences, biotechnology. So those are some of the areas that we actually see are growing, and I truly believe at least 60–70% of the jobs hopefully in the future are going to be in a number of other areas besides fossil fuels. So that's one question. The second question is that obviously education is really critical. A couple of speakers actually talked about, the issue that there's unemployment among the youth in Africa, and I truly believe education is the key. And one part of education is the entrepreneurship and innovation training. And I was just wondering if any of the speakers had comments related to any of the trainings.
It's a very good question. So, and I'll come to you.
Thank you. And I'd like to join the first question in thanking our speakers all of today, and especially His Excellency for being here. I last visited Accra in 2011, and it made a huge impact. My name is Graham Sinclair. I'm principal of Sustainable Investment Consulting, also president of the Africa Sustainable Investment Forum, looking to promote sustainable investment in Africa. My question to you, Your Excellency, but also to the other panelists, if you will, I'm intrigued by leadership. And I'm intrigued by political leadership because of how critically important it is to organize the efforts in Africa and looking for partnerships between public sector and private sector. And so I'm interested in the role, for example, of the Mo Ibrahim Prize, which was last awarded in 2011 to President Perez of Cape Verde. Simply put, a prize for lifting countries out of poverty, putting them on a sustainable path, but also importantly, leaving office when the term ends. Which you could also consider a great investment in one's personal future because it's a $5 million prize. So as an executive, it would also be a good ending. What is the view on political leaders leading by example, and when could we have more Africans winning the Mo Ibrahim Prize?
Thank you, sir. Very good question. I'll take one more. I see Bob at the end, please. We can get to the mic to you. And then we also have Bob Diamond, who's walked in. Bob, welcome. I know you're doing the next panel soon. Delighted to have you here. The time is running out.
Thank you, Amir. Rob Collarina, AIAC Investment. My question is a short one. For Your Excellency, I appreciate your commentary on and the specifics on the Ebola situation. Could you just share a little bit about how your administration has quantified and addressed that? And then to what extent have you, with your other leader neighbors, quantify, or is there variance between the risk, damage, and the size, those type of things? I'd be interested in that.
So I think, Mr. President, may I invite you to start with the questions that have been raised, and we request the other panelists to add. Thank you. Yep. It's probably easier.
Just quickly, I would start from the last question first. That is quantifying the risks that it poses to growth and investment in West Africa, if I'm right. The international monetary institutions have said that this year, countries affected by Ebola would see a reduction of 3.6 to 4% in GDP growth as a result of Ebola. The outbreak began in March, which typically in West Africa is the beginning of the agricultural season. And so that whole season is lost. So agriculture is going to suffer, and those countries might need some humanitarian assistance in terms of food aid. It will affect all other West African countries, even those that have not seen an outbreak of Ebola, like Ghana. Ghana has seen no outbreak of Ebola, but I know of major conferences and major investment groups that were supposed to visit that have postponed their visit because of the outbreak. And so definitely our own economies, even for those of us who have not seen a single case of Ebola, is going to take a hit. We probably might shave off some 1% of GDP growth this year. So it's going to have an economic impact, and we must do everything possible to bring it under control as quickly as possible. Let me address the other question, which, if I remember exactly which it was, it talked about leadership. And I believe if you look a decade back and you look at Africa today, you see more leaders abiding by the tenets of democracy than existed in the past. There are more elections taking place. There are more leaders leaving office when it's time to leave. I don't say there are no exceptions, but I do think that one of the things that Africa is enjoying is the democracy dividend. At least in my country, since 1992, we've held 6 successful elections. 2 presidents have left office after 7 terms in office. My predecessor died in his first term, and I got sworn in as president, and I fought an election and won. I have another election coming up in 2016, and if I win that, I'll serve a second term, and I leave office in 2020, and somebody else will take it up from where you leave off and continue. The former messianic philosophy that surrounded leaders is gone for good. And I believe that Africa would continue to see entrenched democracy. Civil society organizations are very active, and I believe that is good for investment and economic growth. Incidentally, the Mo Ibrahim Prize was supposed to be held in Ghana this year in October, and it's one of the fora that have been put off as a result of the Ebola scare. And it's most unfortunate, but I guess that frantic efforts are being made to fix a new date to hold that event. Entrepreneurship training, yes, it's one of the things we're involved in. We have seen an expansion in tertiary education in Africa, especially in countries like Ghana, and we have young people graduating at all levels of the tertiary stream. One of the major difficulties we faced is in the slow growth of the private sector to be able to absorb a lot of these graduates that are coming out. And so most of them come seeking employment in the public sector. But there's a limit to what employment the public sector can guarantee. And that is why we are looking to promote private sector investment, and then also to provide the graduates coming up with entrepreneurial training so that they can go out and set up their own small and medium enterprises. And so about a month ago, I launched a new initiative we call the YES Initiative. That is a Youth Enterprise Support Initiative. And what we do is to invite proposals from young graduates, evaluate those proposals and see what they want to do, and then get successful businessmen to serve as mentors to these young people and help them come up with a project proposal that is fundable. And we've committed 10 million Ghana cedis to this, so we will finance the projects, and under the mentorship of the already successful business people, we will put them through until they're able to stand on their own feet, and then we will graduate them from the program. And so, yes, we're taking that into consideration, and we're working on it. In what areas are there opportunities for investment apart from, fossil fuels and energy and the traditional large-scale investments? There are opportunities for investments in so many areas. I just gave a few, but I mean in tourism and hospitality, in restaurants, the service sector, in banking, in finance, in telecommunications. I mean, all the sectors are open to investment, and we're seeing inward investment from all over the world, and including domestic investment mobilization within Ghana itself in all these areas that I've talked about. A very successful youth summit was held here in the U.S. on the sidelines of the U.S.-Africa Leadership Summit. Ghana had a particularly large contingent of young people being chosen to participate. And most of them are young, bright, sharp Ghanaians who, several of them who have started their own small and medium enterprises already. And what we're looking to do is to ensure that we create the vehicle with which to support these young people to grow their businesses and be able to employ others, so that we're able to get more of our young people, finding jobs. As we said, Africa has a fast-growing population, which is a very good advantage, but also is a key threat if we're not able to harness it properly. If you have hundreds of thousands of young people finishing university and polytechnics every year, and they can't find jobs, and they're just sitting idly, that is a threat, to security and stability. And so it's something that we need to take cognizance of and expand the economies, create opportunities for jobs, train them to be able to become entrepreneurs themselves and be able to absorb their colleagues into their businesses. I think that's the way to go. And we're going to give it our best shot. Thank you.
Mr. President, thank you so much for the explanations. They're very helpful. In fact, the youth initiative is what President Obama would say, yes, we can, is how you've designed it. May I invite you to thank the Honorable President Mahama, the Deputy Chairperson of the African Union Commission, the Undersecretary General for the United Nations Special Advisor on Africa, Ambassador Magid Abdulaziz, and always ever gracious host, Hubert Danso. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Doing business in Africa. You can't afford to be without Africa Investor.